Hi, everyone. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for April 11th, 2025. It's nice to be back after a 2-week break. First, a summary of the news. California rejects bills to protect women's sports. Activists at Berkeley protest the YMCA's failure to safeguard women in locker rooms. The Department of Education and the Department of Justice announced the creation of a Title IX Special Investigations Team. The NHS suspends a nurse over misgendering. Kathleen stalk vindicated at Sussex University. The Trump administration revokes all non-essential funding from the Maine Department of Corrections after they allowed a man in a woman's prison. And Maine officials won't comply with the federal trans athlete ban. First, the news from California. On April 1st, the California Assembly rejected 2 bills that would have barred males from women and girls' sports in educational institutions. One bill, Assembly Bill 89, would have required that the California Interscholastic Federation change its rules to require that only those born female can participate in girls' interscholastic sports. The other bill, Assembly Bill 844, would have changed state law to require student athletes at university and K-12 levels to play on the sports teams and use facilities according to their sex at birth. Both bills were rejected in party line votes, and the rhetoric got quite heated, with Democratic Assemblyman Rick Chavez comparing attempts to pass these bills with anti-transgender persecution in Nazi Germany. That said, there were many people who came to Sacramento to testify in favor of these bills, including Democrats and gay people. But they were unable to sway the politicians of the Democratic Party, which has faced institutional capture by gender ideology. These were not the last California bills regarding gender ideology in this legislative session. On April 9th, hearings were held for SB 418, that would redefine sex to include gender identity in medical settings. One person who spoke against the bill during the hearings was Julie Lane, a San Francisco lesbian Democrat from the group Women Are Real, and we'll post a link to her testimony below.
My name is Julie Lane. I'm a lifelong Democrat, a co-founder of the group called Women Are Real, and I'm a lesbian from San Francisco. SB 418 would hold health insurers liable for discrimination if they don't aid in procedures that would horrify Dr. Mengele, like blocking healthy kids' puberty so they never fully develop or mature, including their brains, which is a pedophile's dream world, and administering cross-sex hormones that forever change the body, and removing or rearranging genitalia as if humans can be Mr. Potato Head. They cannot. Health plans have been required to pay for these heinous procedures since 2013, but this bill takes it further and actually denies the reality of sex by redefining sex to include gender identity, which is feelings, which change from day to day. SB 418 would enshrine extreme transgender body modification as a sex-based right. We are ruining kids who would very likely grow up to be lesbian, gay, and bisexual. I don't think anybody that is gay or lesbian that believes in transgenderism is a gay savior. It is not the same as being gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Affirming kids away from being gay is wrong, and that's what's happening with the transgender trend. I don't know why you would be ashamed of the LGB community and continue to write bad laws, especially this law, which is going to be used in a medical setting where sex really does matter. I would say stop codifying dangerous pseudoscience into California's medical system and vote no on this bill.
And speaking of Women Are Real's activism in California, on April 5th, members of the group Women Are Real protested in front of the Berkeley YMCA in support of Elizabeth Kenny. Kenny is a woman who encountered an angry man in the Berkeley YMCA women's locker room on March 26th. This man, according to Kenny, flipped out on an elderly woman who told him to cover up his genitals. Kenny reported this incident to the YMCA management, who didn't care. She then complained to the Berkeley police, only to be told that there was nothing they could do about it, saying that it would be a crime for him to be nude on the sidewalk, but not the women's locker room. The pro-Elizabeth Kenny protesters were met with a mix of support and opposition and will post links to the social media accounts covering this event. Given that Berkeley is a huge epicenter for gender ideology, largely stemming from the academic theories promoted at the University of California at Berkeley, it's a breakthrough to see the first signs of resistance there. Gender ideologues should know that there is no corner of this country that they can expect to go unopposed.
I did not consent to a dude being in the locker room at the YMCA, in the women's locker room, all right? Just because one person in Berkeley consents to a dude being in the locker room doesn't mean that everybody does. One person doesn't speak for everybody. I did not consent. I do not consent. I will never consent. And I will keep fighting. I will be heard. This is not okay. I will fight for my daughter and my granddaughter and the rest of women's rights to have men out of the women's locker room. We don't consent.
I can see what you're doing, okay, and cool. I'm glad you're doing it.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for your support.
Thank you so much for doing this. Yeah. This is why we don't use, we use the gym, but we don't use the facilities. Thank you.
And now moving on to national news. On April 4th, the U.S. Department of Justice and the U.S. Department of Education announced that they will create a Title IX Special Investigations Team that will, as its name suggests, investigate Title IX violations at educational institutions. This announcement comes after a slew of complaints against schools for allegedly violating the rights of female students and athletes by allowing trans-identified males in women's locker and restroom facilities, as well as women's sports teams. Secretary of Education Linda McMahon said, quote, "From day one, the Trump administration has prioritized enforcing Title IX to protect female students and athletes. Traditionally, our Office for Civil Rights takes months, even years, to complete Title IX investigations. OCR under this administration has moved faster than it ever has, and the Title IX SIT will ensure even more rapid and consistent investigations. To all the entities that continue to allow men to compete in women's sports and use women's intimate facilities, there's a new sheriff in town. We will not allow you to get away with denying women's civil rights any longer." Unquote. Attorney General Pamela Bondi echoed this sentiment by saying, quote, "Protecting women and women's sports is a key priority for this Department of Justice. This collaborative effort with the Department of Education will enable our attorneys to take comprehensive action when women's sports or spaces are threatened and use the full power of the law to remedy any violation of women's civil rights." Unquote. This announcement marks the escalation of a battle between the Trump administration and largely Democratic states over males in women's sports. And with that, I'll send it over to you, Jos.
Thanks, Arianne. A senior NHS nurse, Jennifer Mealy, was suspended after she addressed a transgender pedophile as Mr. and later spoke publicly about the situation. Mealy, 40, a Christian originally from Uganda, expressed that she was punished for whistleblowing, stating, "I am devastated to have been suspended just for whistleblowing." She claims she faced racist abuse from the patient, who is a convicted sex offender, brought to her ward for treatment from the men's prison. During a procedure discussion, Mealy used accurate medical terminology, which angered the patient. The patient then lunged at Mealy while verbally assaulting her with racist slurs. Despite the patient's racist remarks, Mealy was the one to receive a warning and was referred to the Nursing and Midwifery Council. Following her comments to the media, she was suspended over what the NHS Trust claimed was a potential breach of patient confidentiality. Mealy has begun legal proceedings against Epsom and St. Helier University Hospital's NHS Trust, alleging harassment, discrimination, and human rights violations. The Christian Legal Center is representing Mealy in this case. The Christian Legal Center's chief executive had this to say, quote, This is a legally protected act under the Equality Act. The NHS has become so entrenched in transgender ideology that it is willing to side with a man brought in from prison in chains who was shouting racist abuse over a Christian nurse, end quote. Political figures, including conservative leader Kemi Badenoch, criticized Melee's suspension, urging the government to protect workers stating biological realities. An NHS spokesperson emphasized the importance of confidentiality and stated that Melee's complaints were under investigation. Moving now to a bit of good news. The University of Sussex is facing a record fine of £585,000 for failing to uphold freedom of speech and academic freedom, thus breaching two conditions of registration. According to a ruling by England's higher education regulator, the Office for Students, OFS, found that the university had significant and serious breaches related to free speech, suggesting that policies meant to prevent harassment resulted in a quote-unquote chilling effect that caused staff and students to self-censor. The OFS investigation began over 3 years ago, following the departure of Kathleen Stock. Stock is a philosophy professor who left the university after enduring a 3 years long bullying campaign by students and her peers over her views about gender ideology. Arif Ahmed, the OFS director for freedom of speech, noted that the fine was reduced since it was the first case of its kind and that the findings would help other universities understand their obligations regarding free speech. Congrats to Kathleen Stock on this vindication. It's much deserved. Turning now to Maine. U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced that the Trump administration has stopped all non-essential funding to Maine's Department of Corrections. This action follows the state's decision to house a 6'1", 245-pound man who identifies as a woman in the women's prison. The case in question involves Andrea Balser, a 24-year-old convicted of murdering both of his parents and the family dog with a K-bar style military knife on October 31st, 2016. He was subsequently convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. He started out in the men's prison and initially claimed he didn't know why he killed his parents and the family's little chihuahua, but later decided that the murders were driven by his desire to transition and his parents' unwillingness to comply with the transition. It's worth mentioning that Andrew was just a few weeks shy of turning 18 when he killed his parents. A reasonable person could expect that someone suffering with gender dysphoria would move out of a non-supportive family home at the first opportunity, not that the individual would commit a gruesome double murder. Also worth mentioning is that Andrew's brother, Christopher, has spoken out against Andrew, stating that Andrew is a remorseless liar who deserves to live out his days in prison. Since the Maine prison policy allows inmates to be classified by their gender identity if they are diagnosed with gender dysphoria, Andrew was granted a transfer to the women's prison section in January of 2023 after meeting Maine state requirements. But Attorney General Pam Bondi isn't playing games. In an interview on Fox News about pulling federal funding from Maine's Department of Corrections, Bondi mentioned the ongoing sports issue in Maine as well. She said, quote, "We will pull your funding. We will protect women in prison. We will protect women in sports. We will protect women throughout this country," end quote.
Now back to Maine. Yeah, what's happening there is they're not abiding by what President Trump said. They're allowing men and women's sports. And in the case right now, what we did last night, some breaking news, we pulled all non-essential funding from the Department of Corrections in Maine because they were allowing a man in a woman's prison, a giant 6'1", 245-pound guy who committed a double murder with a knife, stabbed his parents to death and the family dog, and he identified as a woman. So they were letting him be housed in a female prison. No longer. We will pull your funding. We will protect women in prison. We will protect women in sports. We will protect women throughout this country. No more of that.
In a bipartisan survey by the American Parents Coalition of roughly 600 registered Maine voters agrees. They found 63% support for school sports participation based on biological sex, and 66% polled believe it's fair to restrict women's sports to biological women. It's hard to anticipate how any of this will play out, but it's good to see additional surveys showing a majority of American voters believe in sex-segregated spaces, sports, prisons, bathrooms, and on and on. More and more Americans have drawn a line in the sand at the intersection of their cognitive dissonance and the be kind platitudes of the progressive left. And it seems that more often than not, Americans are choosing to believe their eyes, their ears, and their instincts. And now to Scott for more news from Maine.
Thank you, Jos. In a significant legal confrontation, Maine has initiated a lawsuit against the Trump administration following the federal government's decision to freeze over $5.7 million in educational funding. This action stems from Maine's refusal to enforce a federal mandate prohibiting trans-identified men from participating in girls' and women's sports. Many female athletes and advocates for women's sports have expressed frustration and concern over the inclusion of biological males in female divisions. They argue that the presence of biologically male competitors undermines the fairness and integrity of women's sports, given the average advantages in strength and speed that males retain. The dispute began when President Donald Trump issued an executive order titled "Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports," which directs federal agencies to withhold funding from educational programs that allow trans-identified men to compete in women's sports. Maine's policies, which permit transgender athletes to participate in sports consistent with their gender identity, are in direct opposition to this order. In February, during a meeting with Governor Janet Mills, President Trump warned that noncompliance would result in funding cuts. Because of this, U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins announced the suspension of certain USDA educational funds, asserting that Maine's stance violates Title IX provisions. In response, Maine Attorney General Aaron Frey filed a federal complaint seeking a temporary restraining order to prevent the withholding of funds. The Maine Principals Association, overseeing high school sports, and School Administrative District 51, which includes Greeley High School, have both stated their intent to adhere to the state law and the Maine Human Rights Act, rather than comply with the federal directive. Complying with the federal transgender athlete ban would be a complex and contentious move for Maine. The state's own Human Rights Act prohibits discrimination based on gender identity, and most school districts already follow an inclusive policy that supports transgender athletes. Reversing these practices would not only violate state law, but also risk public backlash, legal challenges, and disruption to long-established school policies. With strong political opposition from state leaders and a cultural climate generally supportive of TQ+ rights, Maine faces significant legal and ethical hurdles in aligning with the federal directive, making noncompliance a stance rooted as much in legal application as it is in principle. And that's the news from Maine.
Thanks, Scott. I'm really curious about these Maine cases, and I think immediately to Pennsylvania. I just traveled to Pennsylvania recently to visit my mother, and when some of the news that we've had regarding sports in particular harkens back to Pennsylvania also having the same. So it's going to be a curious thing to me to see how many different states have interplays where they're kind of holding the line, and the federal government's just like, no. Because Pam Bondi is from Florida. She is not, she's rooting and tooting. She's coming and she's ready to go. She's not messing around. It's just Florida on display.
I agree. This is interesting. And in researching the story, you think a federal mandate is a federal mandate, but there's layers like an onion to this issue. I wrote about the legal precedents in state and then school by school and then human rights acts that have been implemented. All of those are hurdles to this. And it will draw this out for quite a while, I think, if there is resistance to implementing safety in girls' sports, because that's really what this is about. It's about safety. And it will put states in a very interesting position if they continue to support, disadvantages for girls and women in their sports, if they continue to allow trans-identified men. The last interesting thing I'll say is there is not support for this. People do not want this, and they have been very plain about this. I'm originally from Iowa, and I happened to have the opportunity to watch Chuck Grassley at a town hall. He couldn't get a word in edgewise. There was no support for anything that was going on in government relating to trans issues. It was very interesting.
That is an interesting observation. I live in a very liberal place. I live in Northern California. And so there are not surprisingly a lot of people who really do not like Trump and are, sounding the alarm bells about a lot of the things Trump has done. But I haven't personally encountered people who are really talking about trans policies as part of sort of their outrage. I have heard some people who are defenders of DEI, sort of broadly speaking. And I've definitely a lot of people who are upset about Ukraine and NATO and that sort of thing. But tariffs, but I'm not really getting the sense that people are like animated to resist Trump over the trans thing. That seems to be something that Democratic politicians are doing, but it's, yeah, like you said, it's not really popular.
Yeah, polling keeps coming back federally and in the state case in Maine of a majority of voters feeling like, yes, we want single sex spaces, we want single sex sports. It just makes sense. And so it is really like these things that are kind of on the same trajectory of uh, feeling like we talk about like the tide has turned, or is the tide going to turn, or has it? I feel like it has, yes. Like we still see that there are hangups and there are people that are caught in the crosshairs. But for the tone and tenor of the populace in general, like when I was looking at videos about the Andrew Balser case, the comments in those videos were very firm, most of them about using his sex as male and not mistaking this as female crimes. Like more and more people are speaking out, even if it's in a comment section, to say that they don't agree with pandering, especially for people who are violent criminals. So hopefully that we have actually broken a barrier, and now we need to ride that public sentiment and keep encouraging people to speak out and use their voice to say, yeah, I don't agree with this trans stuff. Like we need single sex spaces in sports and prisons and bathrooms and like right down the line.
Yeah, and California, I really I'm keeping my eye on, in part because I'm from there, but also, because of like Gavin Newsom, likely wants to run for president. So, in terms of how California is going to respond to the Title IX investigations will be a very interesting one. So far, I haven't heard any updates. I've heard that like there are a lot of entities in California that are being sued, but I haven't heard like a definitive statement from like the governor or attorney general about the extent to which they're willing to risk federal funding over this. So that's going to be a really important thing to look out for.
And two, it will sort of tell us about, is federal funding the stick that we need? Is that really what's going to work? Or will these very swift and I'm going to say sneaky laws that have been passed over the last couple of years to enshrine men and women's sports and unfair participation, they're in place now, unfortunately. How hard will it be to undo this? Is public opinion strong enough to get people to reverse these? We're in for a battle.
Yeah, legislatively, it's very hard to get rid of. Like I was saying, they rejected California legislator rejected bills in the legislature to ban males from women's sports and to change California laws. But of course, if there's actually a court ruling or a federal mandate, then we're, in a whole different territory here. That might be enough to stop it, but who knows? Maybe it won't be. Candace Jackson, who we've interviewed before, she made a point like that it's extraordinarily rare for the Department of Education to actually cut federal funding. That like they make threats, but it's very rare that that actually happens. So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, Maine really leaned into it because they're not backing down on anything. So maybe Maine is just going to be the example because the under Pam Bondi, like there's just not gonna it's gonna be a fight. So maybe this is like we're gonna put Maine on display and we're gonna have a fight. We're gonna duke it out. We'll see what happens in the courts.
It's surprising to me that Maine is the state that's doing this. I mean, it's yeah, I mean, I guess it's a blue state, but they have a Republican senator, Susan Collins, who's always, facing these very tough reelection battles, and it seems like this is a case where Democrats are are risking something by doing this. It's not like California where the senators are going to be Democrats as a shoo-in.
Historically, Democrats have always fought for the underdog. And I think it's interesting that there are Democrats who are breaking ranks and are fighting for the underdog. And unfortunately, the underdog is the everyday person who just wants to participate in sports fairly. How did we get to the point where that's an underdog? Or a person who wants to go into the bathroom in a single sex space, how is that the underdog now? How did we get here? That's a really hard question to answer, especially with everything that's going on. But yeah, I have a feeling more Democrats, and I can't prove this, but I have a feeling more Democrats will wake up. I think, like, I've heard the expression the tide is turning. I think it is. I do believe it is. I wish it would turn a little faster, but this is where we are now.
I feel it, and maybe this is my bias as a Democrat, that and so many of my peers and friends are now kind of those that hadn't really been on board are waking up and are discovering more and more things about an ideology. This is an ideology that has really taken over so much of our lives. For what? Because there's clandestine bills that were passed, and now we're dealing with the repercussions of that across the country. So I think it's also that notion of where they say, "Oh, this never happens." It's happening so much. And a big nod, like we didn't talk about the different women who have abdicated from playing or just refused to play against males. Like there was the woman in fencing, and the recently a disc golf. A lady, I think her name is Bethany, in disc golf, refused to play against the male. Those things, like all of that stuff matters. All of those things are little incremental pieces and parts that help the tide to get bigger and bigger and turn. And so, kudos to them for taking that position and taking it on the chin. Like there's so many women that are caught in the crosshairs now, unfortunately, like Jennifer Melee in the UK. And then we're getting the wins as well. There's just there's so many moving parts here. But yeah, I'm hopeful that the tide is getting bigger and bigger, and more people speak out, more people use their voice.
And on that note, thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you again next week.